About 10 years ago, I read a book that estimated there were more than 30 million PowerPoint presentations given around the world every day. 30 million. And this was 10 years ago. Who knows what that number is today? 50 million, 60 million? I don't know what the number is, but what I do know for sure is that the overwhelming majority of these presentations don't work. They're not connecting with their audience. They're not inspiring or motivating or persuasive. And you know this too, right? You know this because you've had to sit through a lot of these presentations. You've seen people project a wall of text on the screen and then proceed to read it word for word as if you couldn't read for yourself. Or you've groaned as yet another slab of bullet points and numbers and acronyms lets you know just how tedious the next 15 minutes is going to be. And we've all seen countless incomprehensible charts and graphs and diagrams that leave us either confused or just bored. Now, the bad news is that nothing we do today is going to protect you from having to sit through one of these presentations in the future. The good news is that they won't be yours. Your presentations will be awesome. So today we're going to talk about the principles of a great PowerPoint presentation, and then I'm going to show you a simple 3-step process that will cement these principles in your mind forever. Your presentations, whether you're giving a sales pitch or a corporate training seminar, whether it's a webinar or a classroom lecture, whatever the subject and whatever the setting, your presentations can be interesting. They can be memorable. And best of all, they can be persuasive. They'll deliver results you never thought possible. My name is Pat Crook, and in my 22-plus year career in the investment business, I've delivered hundreds of sales and educational presentations and sat through hundreds more. And over this time, I've learned that a really well-designed and delivered PowerPoint presentation is one of the most effective persuasion tools ever invented. Now, this course isn't meant to be an in-depth exploration of every facet of making presentations, and it's not a software tutorial. The aim of this course is to shave years off of your learning curve by teaching you the most important principles you need to know to get up to speed quickly. And that's it. Just 1 hour of class focused on the critical elements of how to assemble and display your information to really connect with and influence your audience. Now, before we get into these principles, I want to talk with you about the secret formula. All right, this is the foundation that every successful presentation is built upon, and it's the source of the principles that we're going to be talking about. So I'll see you at the next video. As mentioned in the introduction, every successful presentation has a common foundation that I'm calling the secret formula. The combination of ingredients in this formula is what allows you to grab and hold the attention of your audience and lead them to an inevitable conclusion. The first ingredient of the formula is content, or basically the information you want your audience to take away from the presentation. The second ingredient is design, or the visual aspect. Now, this is where most presentations fail miserably. I'm going to show you how to put together terrific slides that clarify, emphasize, and support your message. The third ingredient is delivery. Now, in the context of this class, when I say delivery, I'm not talking about your performance as a public speaker. What I'm talking about here is how we arrange the content and visuals to most effectively carry your audience from point A, the beginning of your presentation, to point B, the conclusion. So by the time they arrive at point B, not only is your audience informed, but now they're persuaded to your point of view and they're inspired to take action. To deliver a fantastic presentation, you don't have to be a natural-born performer. You don't have to be a gifted graphic artist or hire a professional design firm. To get the results you want, all you have to do is comply with some basic principles in all 3 of these areas. If you can do that, and you can, you're going to be great. So one last time, because this formula is really important, let's just do a quick recap. Okay, the first ingredient in the formula, remember, this is the information we want our audience to take away, content. The second ingredient, this is the visual aspect, design, you got it. And the third ingredient, how we carry our audience from point A to point B, say it with me, delivery. So that's the secret formula. These are the 3 areas we have to pay close attention to when building a presentation: content, design, and delivery. Before we proceed to the first lecture, just a quick word on how this course is organized. I'll be talking with you about some important principles in each of these areas. The first lecture in each section will describe these principles, and then we're going to follow that up with 3 examples taken from actual presentations where you'll be able to see and test yourself on the importance of these principles in a real-world setting. So let's start with content. I'll see you at the next video. In order to be persuasive, the point you're trying to make has to be crystal clear. Your audience shouldn't have to connect dots or make assumptions. You don't want to make them think too much. Your information, your content, needs to lead to an inescapable conclusion. Now let's talk about how you do that. All right, the first principle of content is that every presentation should lead to a single specific objective. The more specific it is, the more persuasive you're likely to be. The second principle is that embedded within this objective, you need to have a call to action. Now, the reason for a call to action is obvious if you're giving a sales presentation, right? You want to ask for the order. But it's also important for educational presentations. For example, let's say you're training people in your company to use some new kind of widget for filing their TPS reports. The best way for them to learn that is to take action and do it as soon as possible, right? You can provide instruction, you can show a demo, and that'll get them part of the way there. But asking them to do something like, as soon as you get back to your cubicle, I want you to open the TPS widget on your computer and file your first report. Okay, that's your first priority. Now, something like that has a lot more impact. If they do it, they'll remember it, and your presentation will have meant something. So you need to have a call to action. The third principle in crafting great content is to start your presentation at the end. Before opening a new PowerPoint file, before writing an outline, you want to identify your single specific objective and your call to action, and then you build a presentation that leads up to that. You need to start with what you want to have happen at the end. Whatever it is, that's the thing that the presentation should be built around. Ideally, your entire presentation is just a support system for the objective and the call to action. So we're going to start at the end and work backward from there when deciding what information to include and what information to exclude. These are the three principles for crafting the content of your presentation. A single objective, embedded within that objective is a call to action, and finally, when we design a presentation, we start at the end. Now, bearing these principles in mind, what we're going to do next is look at a few examples from presentations that I've seen in the last year or two. These are not Hall of Shame type presentations. They're very typical and probably similar to presentations you've given or seen recently. And for that reason, I think they're particularly instructive. So, before you start the next video, please have a pad of paper and a pencil handy. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions regarding each example, and then we'll have a chance to compare notes. So, when you're ready, I'll see you at the next video. What you're going to see now are the final 5 slides in a presentation that actually was not accompanied by a speaker. This presentation is a slideshow that resides on the website of an investor relations firm. Now, just for a little bit of background, investor relations is a subset of public relations. These are firms that work on behalf of small public companies to help them raise their profile in the investment community. So at this point in the slideshow, they'd already reviewed the biographies of the partners in the firm. They'd gone over the type of work they do, showed a list of clients, etc. So the presentation is nearing the end. As you can see on this slide, they're highlighting some of the achievements they produce for clients. Here are some awards that they've won. And the next to last slide, you can see they're kind of winding up for the pitch here. They're showing some of the unique reasons you might want to hire them. And then the final slide ends with 4 additional information and displays their contact info. Now, bearing in mind the principles of content we discussed in the previous lecture, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and answer 2 questions. Question 1, what goes wrong with this presentation? And question 2, how would you fix it? What would you do differently? For you to get the most out of this course, it's really important that you participate in these questions. So please pause the video, take a minute to think about it, and write down your answers. Then when you're ready to compare notes, hit play and we'll resume the conversation. All right, what went wrong with this presentation? First off, let's recap the principles of content. Number 1, every presentation should lead to a single specific objective. Number 2, embedded within that objective should be a call to action. And number 3, when building a presentation, you want to start at the end, right? Start with the objective and call to action in mind and work backward from there. This presentation fails on all 3 counts. So what goes wrong? basically everything. First, there's no clear objective. Actually, scratch that. I think there is an objective, but it's not stated. What they say at the end is just for additional information. What they mean, I think, reading between the lines, is that they would like their audience to make contact with them to advance the conversation to the next step. But remember, in our discussion where we talked about how you don't want to ever make your audience connect the dots on their own or make assumptions. You don't want to make them think too much. In this case, the objective is just left very vague and muddled. Number two, there's no call to action. The phrase for additional information doesn't have any verbs in it. They're not asking the audience to do anything. So it's a very weak, passive way to end a presentation. And then finally, they obviously did not design the presentation around the idea that at the end they would just say, for additional information. Nobody would do that. It's not a real objective. So what they did is what most people do, which is just write a very linear outline, right? This is who we are. This is what we do. This is who we do it for. These are some of our awards. Now let's just tack on an ending. That's what's happened here. And that's why I'm guessing the results from this presentation are probably very poor. So that's what goes wrong. What would I do differently? Well, first, I would start by identifying an objective and a call to action. So if the objective was to get the audience to make contact and further the conversation, that's fine. That's a good objective. The call to action then should be to ask for that. Call us today. It could be as simple as that. So with those things in mind, now the challenge is how do you build a presentation that leads naturally and persuasively to that end? So I think for this particular case, what I would do is look back at some of the awards they've won. This one here was for Best Investor Relations Program. That's pretty good, right? This might be a perfect opportunity for a case study type of presentation where you would display the work done for this client, the fantastic results the client enjoyed as a result of that work, and then you could lead right into a call to action where you could say something like, if you call us today, we'll do two things for you. Number one, we can conduct a needs assessment and provide you with a detailed proposal that will show you how you can receive similar results. And number two, we'll also provide you with a detailed price quote so you know exactly what it costs. So call now and let's get started. Something like that would have a lot more impact and would have a much better chance of delivering a result that was wanted from this presentation. So that's what I would do differently. I'd love to hear what you would do. If you feel like sharing, please leave your thoughts along with any questions in the Q&A section of the course dashboard. I'll attempt to answer every question as promptly as I can. All right, now let's move on to our second example. What you're looking at now is the final slide from a continuing education class presented at a conference for credit union executives. Bearing in mind the principles of content that we've reviewed in the last two videos, I'm going to ask you to once again pause this video, review the slide that you're looking at, and answer the same two questions that we answered last time. What goes wrong here, and how would you fix it, or what would you do differently? So go ahead, hit pause, take a moment and write your answers down, and then when you're ready to resume, click play. Okay, what goes wrong here? Remember our first principle of content. Every presentation should lead to a single specific objective. This presentation appears to lead to a whole bunch of objectives. I count 1, 2, 3, 7 bullet points all under the heading of next steps. When you ask your audience to take 7 next steps, your success rate is going to be pretty low. That's just too much for them to remember, let alone act on. We should lead to a single objective. But there's something even worse going on here. These aren't really 7 objectives, are they? When you read into these bullet points a little more closely, you find a bunch of needless filler. Look at bullet number 2, visit regulatory websites. Is that something you think really needs to be said to a room full of executives? Probably not. Or look at the last one, reach out for assistance if needed. That's an instruction you would literally give a first grader. So if I was this presenter, I would want to be really careful about these next steps I was asking my audience to take. You do want to connect the dots for your audience so they don't have to make assumptions or think too much, but you don't want to dumb it down so much that you insult their intelligence. It's really important to know your audience so you can communicate on an appropriate level. So what went wrong in this example was that not only were there too many objectives at the end, but they were completely unnecessary and in the process probably damaged the speaker's credibility by demonstrating a lack of knowledge or lack of respect for the audience. So what I would do differently is first remove the blindingly obvious bullet points. Out of the 3 remaining points, one of them is the real presentation, the real objective. So I would pick one of those and build the presentation around that. So let's say, for example, it's the 3rd one there. Review your balance sheet and unused commitments. So maybe you want to build a presentation that shows why that's so important and shows people exactly how to do that. And then when you get to the end, you can make a call to action that's something like, first thing you do Monday morning when you get back to your office is pull up your balance sheet, review your unused commitments, and using the checklist I'm handing out right now, you're going to make a decision on whether or not your risk weighting is appropriate. Okay, I don't know anything about credit unions. I'm just winging it here, but I'm imagining that something along those lines would have a lot more impact and be a lot more useful to the audience. They could actually receive a benefit from the class, which is what you want when you deliver a presentation, isn't it? So that's what I would do. I'd love to hear what you would do. Again, please feel free to leave thoughts and questions in the Q&A. Now let's proceed to the 3rd and final example in the content section. All right, for our 3rd example within the content section, we're going to review a 3-slide sequence from a webinar presented by a marketing consultant. These are the final 3 slides in the webinar, and just for a little background context, the title of this webinar was No Excuses, and it was about overcoming procrastination. What you're looking at here is the 3rd to last slide. You can see, first off, there's a call to action of sorts. It says, leverage these free resources. Leverage is kind of a weak verb, but it's better than nothing, right? And there's a bunch of offers on this slide. There's some downloads, audio files, webinars, etc. The 2nd to last slide has another offer, and this is for the full-blown course. This webinar introduced the concepts that the course dives into more deeply. You can see there's 5 hours of audio, an ebook with some worksheets, etc. Then the final slide has another offer. This is to join her silver membership program. So, as with our previous examples, bearing in mind the principles of content that we've been reviewing, I want you to pause the video and ask yourself what goes wrong with this presentation and how would you fix it? So take a moment, write your answers down, and hit play when you're ready to resume. Okay, what goes wrong here? I think in this example it's pretty obvious. 11 offers. That's 10 too many. The problem with multiple offers is twofold. First, you introduce what's known as the paradox of choice. You're asking your audience to make too many decisions. When you offer one thing, I only have to make one decision. I can answer yes or no. And if you've done a good job with your presentation up to that point, you're going to get a certain percentage of yeses. But if you ask your audience to make 11 decisions, they're going to become paralyzed. They won't proceed through the whole list and make a decision on each. They're much more likely to say, let me think about it, which is code for, I'm never going to think about this again. So too many choices fosters indecision. The second problem with multiple offers is that as a presenter, you run the risk of coming across as needy or desperate. When you say, I've got this thing for sale, but if you don't like it, I've got these free downloads, and if you don't like those, you could listen to my podcast. But if you don't want that, I also have a YouTube channel, or you could really blow your credibility as a speaker when you appear overly eager to get me to take something. To be persuasive, you want to project confidence and authority. If you're offering something that is really useful, something you feel good about, you're going to be excited to tell that story, right? But if you're hedging your bets and saying, if you don't like that, I've got these other things, then you don't project confidence. And if you aren't confident about what you're trying to sell, I certainly won't be confident about buying it. So that's the problem here, too many offers. What would I do to fix it? I would focus on one thing and one thing only. Remember, this is a first principle of content. We want a single specific objective. What this presenter was really trying to do with the webinar was sell the complete course, right? So I would focus on that to the exclusion of everything else. I would even get rid of this talk of the silver membership, at least in the initial offer. You can always offer sweeteners later, but you don't want to weaken or confuse the one decision you're asking the audience to take. A sweetener isn't a choice that has to be made. It's just a bonus you get for making the right decision, and it should be presented that way. So that's how I would fix it. Now, before we move on to the design section of the course, let's just do a quick recap of the principles of content, all right? Number one, how many objectives do we want our presentation to have? One, that's right, a single specific objective. The more specific you are, the more persuasive you're likely to be. Number two, embedded within that objective, we want a call to what? That's right, a call to action. And finally, when we're building a presentation, where do we start? We start at the end. We start with the objective and the action in mind and work backward from there. All right, that's content. Now, once again, please feel free to share any thoughts or questions in the Q&A section of the course dashboard. Now let's move on to design. I'll see you at the next video. In the introduction, I mentioned that design, or the visual aspect, is where most presentations fail miserably, and it's really true. Design is the Achilles heel of most PowerPoint presentations, and the reason for this is pretty simple. PowerPoint is really easy to use. It only takes a few minutes to hammer out a bunch of bullet points, maybe import some clip art, and you've got a presentation. Hooray! The problem is that most presenters, when they're working through their PowerPoint outline, they're looking at it from their perspective. What would be the fastest, easiest, most logical way for me to arrange this information? Instead, we need to look at things through the eyes of our audience. What will allow them to really understand and connect with our information? How can the visual aspect help clarify or support what we're saying or simplify a complex process that we're trying to explain? This is where PowerPoint can really shine when you use it correctly. So now we're going to talk about 3 basic principles of design, and these are things anyone can do. After we review these principles, we're going to walk through some examples, and you'll have a chance to test yourself just like we did in the content section. All right, so the first principle of design is that each slide should represent just one idea. All right, a single idea per slide. Second principle, PowerPoint needs to be thought of as a tool. It's simply a means to an end. It's a visual aid, not the job. Just a tool that can help make your job easier. And the final principle is that when it comes to visuals, like charts and graphs and tables and diagrams, you need to keep things as simple and obvious as possible. If you ever hear yourself saying, "Let me explain what this means," you've already lost. So when it comes to visuals, keep it simple. All right, these are our 3 principles. Now let's go on to the next video and look at our first example. Our first design example is from a presentation given by one of the largest consulting firms in the world. The topic of this presentation is obviously financial fraud. Given the 3 principles of design that we just talked about, remember those? A single idea per slide. PowerPoint is simply a tool, not the job, just a tool to help you do the job. And finally, when it comes to graphics, we want to keep things simple. So those are our 3 principles of design. Now I'm going to ask you to pause the video, take a look at this slide and ask yourself, what went wrong here and how would you fix it? Take a moment, do that, and when you're ready, hit play and we'll resume the conversation. Okay, so what goes wrong here? Well, the first principle is that each slide should represent a single idea, right? How many ideas does this one have? Well, let's look at it. We've got a headline and a subhead that introduces the subject. And then we've got a setup type of sentence that introduces the subject in a little more detail. And then we've got all these different elements, right? Transactional, personal, fractured logic, systemic weaknesses. And then there's this triangle-shaped graphic. And then finally, don't forget, each bullet point is its own idea. So the way I count it is that we've got 28 ideas on this slide. That's way too many. Let me show you why more than one idea is a problem. This is a picture of my desktop. It's a pretty standard setup. I've got 2 monitors, and normally each monitor is split into 2 active windows. So there are 4 windows open at any given time. Now let's say this presentation was a webinar, okay, and I have that open in one of the windows. Now let's say this slide comes up. Bear with me for a moment. I'm going to play the role of presenter now for a second, and you just follow along, okay? So I might introduce a slide by saying, and now we're going to talk about why financial fraud occurs. Here's what we know. When the right combination of elements are present, given a long enough period of time, financial fraud will occur. It's a given. Let's talk about those elements. What are they? The first category we call transactional. For example, when expectations freeze, where are your eyes looking right now? I'll bet they're not looking at the bullet point I was just trying to flesh out. If you're like most people, when a slide like this is presented, you read ahead. And you can read a lot faster than I can speak. So while I'm explaining bullet point number 1, you're already reading bullet number 10. And that's a problem because when you come to the end of the slide, when you've read everything, you're not going to refocus your attention on me, the speaker. You're not going to come back and pay attention to me while I explain all of the things you just finished reading. The bigger problem is now that you're bored, it's so easy to become distracted, right? With my setup here, I don't even have to turn my head. I can just shift my eyes a fraction of an inch, and now I'm engaged in something completely different. And the presenter faces the monumental task of trying to win my attention back, which is a lot harder to do than just not lose it in the first place. This isn't just a webinar problem, by the way. You've all been bored in a classroom and seen people whispering to each other or playing a game on their phone or doodling on a pad. So that's the problem with cramming too many ideas on a single slide. Now, what would I do differently? The only thing you can really do is break the ideas apart so that each resides on its own slide. These aren't the slides I would use, by the way. I'm just showing how the sequence of ideas might look when spread out. Now, when you do this, two things are going to happen. First, you're going to have a lot more slides, which is good. It helps keep the attention of the audience when you don't just have one slide on the screen for 15 minutes. They finish reading it, they get bored, and move on to something else, right? Second, it will also help force you to think a little more carefully about the information you're presenting. You won't feel like you have to come up with an 8th bullet point just to make the slide look symmetrical. Now you're more likely to really consider how effectively the information you present supports your message. All right, so that's how I would do it. Again, please feel free to share your ideas or questions in the Q&A section. Now let's move on to our second design example. Welcome to our second design example. What you're looking at here is a slide from a fundraising presentation delivered by a nonprofit, a charitable organization. Now, the style of this slide is what I call the wall of text. Given the principles of design that we've been talking about, I'd like you to pause this video, consider the slide, consider the principles, and then write down your answers to the two questions. What goes wrong here and how would you fix it? Then click play when you're ready to resume the conversation. Okay, what goes wrong here? Well, remember our second design principle is that PowerPoint is a tool. It's not the job. In this case, with this type of unfortunately common slide, PowerPoint is being used as the job. It's just a script, because what always happens when someone projects a slide like this on a screen is that they then read it out loud, word for word, to the audience. And this does massive amounts of damage to a presentation. First, because it bores the audience to tears. And second, it annoys them. They already know how to read. So if that's what you're using PowerPoint for, to just project the words you want to say and then read those words out loud, you'd save everyone a lot of time and hassle by just emailing them your script in advance so they don't have to show up to the presentation. They can just read it at their leisure. So the style and intent of this slide is just a complete misuse of an otherwise effective tool. The second problem is the actual content of the slide. As I mentioned, this was from a fundraising presentation, right? A successful fundraiser depends largely on your ability to make an emotional connection with the audience. And this is actually true of any presentation where you're going to ask someone to make a decision or take an action. People make decisions based on emotion. They might use data and logic to justify the decision, but they almost always make the decision based on emotion. And there's no better way to suck all the emotion out of a room than to read a legal definition like this one. So this slide fails on both the design aspect and the content itself. Now, how would I fix this? That's easy. I'd get rid of it completely. This information is completely unnecessary for this presentation. Now you might ask, what about those audience members that don't know what an endowment is? And there probably will be a small percentage of people that don't know, but that's okay. You can explain the importance of an endowment in 15 seconds. You don't need a slide for that. You could say something like, an endowment is a permanent source of funding. The check you write today will help pay for these important programs tomorrow, next year, and 50 years from now. Long after we're all gone, your gift will live on and continue to provide support. That's all that needs to be said, just something like that. So just because PowerPoint is a good tool doesn't make it right for every job. Just like you wouldn't paint your bedroom ceiling with your favorite hammer. I mean, you could, but it would just be a terrible idea. So not everything you say in a presentation needs a visual aid. All right, now let's move on to our third and final example in the design section. I'll see you at the next video. Welcome to the third and final design example. What I'm going to show you now is a 2-slide sequence from a webinar on email marketing. The first slide, the one that you're looking at right now, has a series of bullet points that explains this concept of offering what the presenter calls a freemium lead capture magnet, which is a term for a free download, like an ebook or a worksheet or a checklist, something like that. And this free offer would hopefully be compelling enough for people to be willing to give you their email address in exchange for receiving the download. And then you would appeal to your list of email addresses by offering them more valuable content and different offers, hopefully spark some interaction, and eventually turn a certain percentage of them into paying clients. So that's the basic idea. All right, the second slide shows that same process in a visual format. You can see it's a diagram or a flow chart. Now, looking at these 2 slides and bearing in mind our principles of design, please go ahead, pause the video, take a moment, write down your answers to the 2 questions, and when you're ready, resume the video and let's compare notes. Okay, so what goes wrong? Well, the first slide violates the principle of a single idea per slide, right? There's 3 main headers on the slide, strategy, tactics, path to profit. And then within those are some more bullet points. So that one should have been broken up into a series of slides. The second one is an even bigger problem. Maybe the kindest word you could use to describe this diagram is intimidating. If you were to show a slide like this in a classroom setting, you would probably be able to physically feel the anxiety level in the room immediately skyrocket. It's just overwhelming. There's so many components and decisions. It just looks like something that would require a lot of study to understand and a ton of work to implement. So this one violates 2 principles. There's too many ideas on the slide and it's way too complicated. How would I fix it? Let's go fishing. This is a great opportunity to use imagery as a metaphor. If you can use a simple, familiar concept as a metaphor or a stand-in for a concept that is unfamiliar or complex, it does a couple things for you. First, it allows your audience to more easily understand what you're trying to explain. And second, it makes your concept more memorable. 30 seconds after this webinar was over, I can virtually guarantee you that not a single person would remember the details of that complex flow chart or what bullet point number 3 was, but everyone can remember a bobber. Nobody knows what freemium lead capture magnet means. That's a term you would probably use if you wanted to make someone's eyes glaze over. So nobody knows what that term means, but everyone knows what bait is. And they're basically the same thing, right? Something free, something compelling. If my target takes a nibble at it, I can carefully reel them in with more offers and content, etc. So this is a concept that can become more relatable when explained by way of metaphor. As an added bonus, the familiarity of the metaphor makes the more complicated details of the strategy easier to recall. I don't have to remember all the steps of the flow chart. Instead, I can use my memory of the basic concept of fishing as a touchstone to then later unpack the more complex details of the marketing strategy. So a great way to think about your slides is to consider them to be like little billboards. When you drive by a billboard at 70 miles an hour, you might only have a fraction of a second to see it out of the corner of your eye, yet you know what the message is, right? They're simple, they're direct, they're interesting. You don't have to pull over and take notes to figure out the meaning. So as you go through the slides in your presentation, try to imagine them as little billboards that help make your message clear, direct, and interesting. Now, before we move on to the delivery section of the course, let's just do a quick recap of our design principles. Number one, how many ideas do we want per slide? That's right, just one, a single idea per slide. Number two, what is the role that PowerPoint plays in your presentation? It's a tool. It's just a means to an end, an aid to help you do your job better. And finally, when it comes to visuals like charts and graphs and diagrams, we want to keep things simple. Think little billboards. All right, that's design. I'll see you at the next lecture where we're going to talk about how to arrange content and design to most effectively persuade and inspire our audience. Okay, now let's talk about the third ingredient of our secret formula, which is delivery. As you'll recall, in the context of this course, delivery is how we carry our audience from point A, the beginning of our presentation, to point B, the conclusion. So when they arrive at the end, they know what our point was, they're persuaded to our point of view, and now they're inspired to take action. But there's a very fine line here. We have to provide enough information to be convincing, but if we provide too much information, our audience could become bored or sidetracked or confused. So we have to strike a delicate balance. I'm going to show you some principles of delivery that will help you maintain that balance and deliver a presentation that is lean and focused and on point. So now let's talk about those principles. Number one, everything we say, every image we show, every chart, every graph, every table, everything in our presentation has to directly support the call to action that we're going to make at the end. If it doesn't, by definition, it's just filler and it distracts from the point that we're trying to make. The second principle is what's known as the rule of three. 1, 2, 3, I forget. And what this means is that you can introduce up to 3 points in support of a concept that you're trying to teach. Any more than that, and people won't remember. For example, if you were to say, here are 11 really important things you need to keep in mind, it doesn't sound credible. People know they can't remember a block of 11 things, right? But if you say, these are the 3 top priorities, people will pay attention and they can remember that. So that's the rule of 3. 1, 2, 3, I forget. And our third principle of delivery, if it isn't memorable, it doesn't count. What that means is that it's extra effort to make the information you present interesting and allow people to remember it after the presentation is over. If you're not willing to put in that effort, then it doesn't belong in the presentation. So as a presenter, you've got a difficult choice to make. You either have to put in the work or just admit to yourself that it needs to be cut out of the presentation. Because if it isn't memorable, it can't have a positive impact, but it definitely can have a negative impact. So you've got to be a ruthless editor. So these are our 3 principles of delivery. Now let's move on to our next video, which is our first example in the delivery module. Welcome to the first example in our delivery module. What you're looking at now is a slide from a presentation that was given at an investment conference. I'm going to give you a little background on this conference because it has a bearing on our discussion of this particular slide. So every presenting company at this conference was a community bank. There were about 65 banks presenting. The audience at the conference was a mix of institutional investors and stock analysts that specialized in banks. They were all sophisticated investors. So that's the background. Now, with our principles of delivery in mind, the principles we just reviewed, I want you to pause the video, answer our 2 questions. What goes wrong here? How would you fix it? Take a minute, think about it, write down your answer, and hit play when you're ready to resume. Okay, so what goes wrong here? Remember our first principle of delivery. Everything we say, everything we show, every slide we show, every chart, every graph, everything has to directly support the call to action that we're going to make at the end. Now, what do you suppose a call to action might be for a presentation like this at a conference like this? Well, we want to raise our profile in the investment community, right? We want to tell a story that's interesting enough to where our audience will be compelled to take the next step. So our call to action might be something like, we're going to ask them to schedule a meeting or schedule a phone call or maybe even take a position in the stock, something like that. But does this slide help do that? It says strategic themes, and Investors are always interested in strategies that might help grow shareholder value, but are these really strategies or are they just platitudes? Let me give you a simple rule of thumb to help tell the difference. It's a strategy if one of your competitors could claim to do the opposite. For example, uh, if you're coaching a football team, you might say our offensive philosophy is to run the ball, run the ball, run the ball relentlessly in order to open up our passing attack later in the game. That's a viable strategy. And another team might claim to do the exact opposite, and that would also be a viable strategy. In this case, none of our competitors, none of the 60 plus other banks at this conference would claim to do the opposite of a single one of these. Can you imagine the next bank up at the podium saying, one of our core strategies is to recklessly manage capital? It'd be interesting. It would probably be kind of funny, but no one would do it because it would be stupid, right? What it tells the audience when you say something like this is that you didn't bother to take enough time to think about who they were. Why would you ever tell a highly sophisticated group of investors that you're going to thoughtfully manage capital? They already know that. So it's a waste of time and it's kind of insulting. Saying things like these does nothing to advance you towards the action that you're going to ask your audience to take at the end. In fact, it probably pushes it further away. So that's what goes wrong with this particular slide. Now, what would I do to fix it? That's easy. Remember, we want to be ruthless editors when we're talking about delivery, when we're talking about carrying our audience from point A to point B. If it doesn't support our call to action, it doesn't belong in the presentation. And in this case, it absolutely does not belong. Now, you might say, well, I've got a 20-minute slot to fill. It doesn't matter. Nobody, not a single person at that conference is going to complain if you finish your presentation in 16 minutes instead of 20. What's important is getting the action that you ask for at the end of the presentation. All right, now let's move on to our second example. Welcome to our second delivery example. The slide that you're looking at now is taken from an estate planning seminar that was given to a group of women. As you can see, this part of the presentation was discussing things that are commonly overlooked during the planning process. Bearing in mind the principles of delivery that we've discussed, I want you to one more time pause the video, answer the two questions, take a minute, write your answers down, and when you're ready to resume, hit play. Okay, what went wrong with this slide? At first blush, it's a very innocuous, common-looking design, right? But there is a problem, and it relates to the second principle of delivery that we discussed, which was the rule of three. 1, 2, 3, I forget. Remember that? So what that means is that anytime we're introducing a new concept or trying to teach something new, we want to limit the amount of supporting information to a maximum of 3 points. Any more than that, and there's a chance that the audience is just going to tune us out completely. When they see a list of 6 or 8 or 10 points, they know they can't remember them all. And honestly, it just doesn't look like it's that important. So what they tend to do is cruise a little bit. Just take it easy. I'm just going to sit here and wait till you say something that's really important. By contrast, if I say, here are 3 really important points that you need to remember, that sounds more credible. That does sound more important. I've done the hard work of conducting triage and prioritizing and being a ruthless editor to just provide you with the 3 most important things that you need to know. So what goes wrong with this slide is that there's too much information. Even though the slide itself looks very spare, 6 bullet points is too many. How would I fix this? I would just trim it down, like I said, to a maximum of 3 points. And I think it's really important that we remember what our job is as presenter. Our job is to not be Wikipedia and reproduce an exhaustive list of data in support of everything we're trying to say. Our job is to carry our audience effectively from point A to point B. Our job is to persuade our audience and inspire them to take action. And the best way to do that, the most efficient way to do that, is to be that ruthless editor and just provide the information that's most important, that's most relevant to helping them progress down that path. Okay, so that's our second example. I'd like you to leave any comments or questions you might have in the Q&A section of the course dashboard. Now let's move on to our third and final delivery example. All right, welcome to our third delivery example. The slide you're looking at now was from a webinar on sales skills. This particular webinar talked a lot about first impressions, or how quickly people would form first impressions of you as a salesperson. So the presenter talked about how you should dress, how you carry yourself, and this slide accompanied a discussion of, or a description of, a way that you should stand or hold yourself while you're speaking to either a group of people or just one-on-one with someone. And this way of standing and holding your hands would project feelings of authority and confidence and openness. So this slide was on the screen for almost 2 minutes while the presenter described this. Bearing in mind, one last time, our principles of delivery, I'm going to ask you to pause the video, write down your answers to our 2 questions, and then just hit play when you're ready to resume. Okay, what went wrong with this slide, or with this part of the presentation? Well, remember, our third principle of delivery is if it's not memorable, it doesn't count. So we have to be willing to put in a little extra effort to make our information memorable. Here's where we need to draw a distinction between a webinar or a remote presentation versus a live presentation in a classroom or a conference room type setting. Now, in a live presentation, this slide is actually probably okay. I mean, it's not fantastic, but it's okay. It's just fine. Remember, PowerPoint is a visual aid. It's there to support us as a speaker, support our message. So if this is on a screen behind us, it really doesn't detract from our message because we're there as a presenter to demonstrate it. So I can describe this gesture, this body language, and I can demonstrate it for you. And then I can ask you to stand up and do it with me. And then you get the best of everything. You get to hear me describe it, you get to see me demonstrate it, and then you get to do it for yourself. And now you're going to remember it, right? But in a remote setting, you can't see me. I can't demonstrate it. So if this slide is on the screen for almost 2 minutes while I'm just describing it, as a presenter, you're in some real trouble here, because remember the environment for a webinar. There's a lot of distractions. So when this slide is on the screen for 2 minutes, there's no way I'm going to focus on that. I'm going to be bored very quickly, and my eyes are going to wander, and now you've lost me. Okay? So that's what's wrong with this. It's just boring. It's not memorable in the least. Now, how would I fix it? Well, I put in a little extra work. So even though as a presenter I'm not there to demonstrate this gesture, I can certainly show it in other ways, right? In fact, I can show it in ways that not only demonstrate how you stand and how you hold your hands, but you can also associate it with feelings of authority and confidence and openness, right? It's not that complicated. It just takes a little bit of extra work. You got to find some images, make some extra slides, but it's worth it if you want people to remember the information you're presenting. If you don't care that much, then don't present it. You got to carve it out, because it's just going to waste everyone's time. Okay, so that's our third example. Now let's very quickly recap our 3 principles of delivery. Number 1, everything we say, everything we show on a screen, all of our visuals, everything in our presentation has to directly support what? That's right, our CTA, our call to action. Our second principle is the rule of 3. Remember this? 1, 2, 3, I forget. And finally, if it's not memorable, it doesn't count. If we're not willing to put in the work to make our information memorable, it's like it never happened and we're just wasting everyone's time. Okay, so that's delivery. Next, we're going to move on to action. So I'll see you at the next video. All right, so far we've covered the most important principles in creating a presentation that is persuasive and will deliver the results that you want. The principles we reviewed are not an exhaustive list, but I promise you, if you use them as a blueprint and you follow that, you're going to see great results. But here's the thing. If you don't take action right now, you won't remember these principles and you won't put them into practice. It's really important that you take concrete steps to commit this knowledge to memory. So now I'm going to walk you through a really simple 3-step plan that's going to help you do exactly that. All right? Step 1, I want you to carve out 1 hour per week. Reserve 1 hour per week. Doesn't matter if it's before work, on your lunch hour, over the weekend. At least 1 hour once a week for a minimum of 5 weeks. It's really easy. Look, do you use Outlook? You probably do. Just go to your calendar, set up a new appointment, give it a name, click the recurrence button, choose the date and the time every week that you want to do this. Set it to run for a minimum of 5 times. You can do it as long as you want, as long as it takes to internalize the concepts, but a minimum of 5. Save it and you're good to go. You won't have to think about it again. Okay, so set that up. 1 hour a week. During this hour, you're going to review 2 presentations. Now, one of these should be from your own files. It's really helpful if you can look at work you've done in the past where you're really familiar with the subject matter and why you did what you did. It makes it easier to see where the gaps are, to see the things that you did really well. So if you have a library of presentations you've designed in the past, I want you to review at least one of the 2 out of there. Now, if you don't have your own files, go to someone in your company. It could be your marketing department, your sales department. Somebody there has a bunch of presentations they've designed. If you don't work for a company that's ever given a presentation, that's okay. Just find one somewhere that you've got a personal connection to. Could be from a nonprofit that you volunteered for. Could be from your church, wherever. It's just really helpful when you have a personal connection to the subject matter. The second one, you can choose at random from a bunch of sources. There are millions of presentations online at SlideShare and BrightTalk and YouTube. BrightTalk and YouTube especially are helpful because you get the audio and the visual. You can see the interaction between the speaker and the PowerPoint slides. So that's really helpful. But at least one from your own files if possible, and the second one at random. All right, so we're going to reserve an hour a week. You're going to review 2 presentations during that hour, and then you're going to grade these presentations on a 9-point scale. What are the 9 points, you ask? Well, they're going to look pretty familiar. The first 3 points are the principles of content that we discussed. Was there a single specific objective to the presentation? Embedded within that objective, was there a call to action? And was it apparent that the presentation was built around that objective? Right? That's our principles of content. Second 3 points are the principles of design. And the third 3 are the principles of delivery. That was our secret formula, right? Content, design, delivery. So that's the grading sheet that you're going to use. This sheet, by the way, is available as a download. It's the next lecture in the series of this course, so you can download that and print it off. Speaking of that, here's the action that I want you to take right now. The first thing you should do is pause the video and set up your weekly reminder. I just showed you how to do it in Outlook, so if you have Outlook, go ahead and do that. If you want to set up your reminder in your phone, go ahead and do that. But just pause the video and set it up before you forget. I'll be here. Did you do it? I hope you did. Step 2 in your action plan, I want you to print 11 copies of the grade sheet. So go ahead and download that PDF, print off 11 copies. You can pause the video. I'll be here again. This is the last time I'm going to ask you to pause the video, by the way. But just get those ready so you're all set, good to go. Now, why 11 copies? I've asked you to review 10 presentations over the next 5 weeks. But worksheet number 11 is for this course. I want you to get into the practice right now by grading this course while the content is still fresh in your mind. So go ahead and do that. It's a great place to start. And let me just say, I really appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate your attention. Hopefully you got something out of this, and I hope that you put it into practice. Good luck with your presentations.